"Fill up my champagne glass, old waiter," my son-in-law said loudly, thrusting the crystal glass toward me with a look of disdain, as if I were nothing more than a shadow unworthy of his high society world. But then someone exclaimed, "Mr. Daniel, what an honor to meet you, but why are you—" In that moment, my son-in-law froze, realizing he had just unwittingly created a serious problem. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The air in my small Richmond apartment always smelled of stale coffee and old paper. This Saturday morning, the autumn light struggled through the faded curtains, painting faint dusty stripes across the worn hardwood floor. Usually I'd spend this time with my violin, letting its voice fill the quiet space, a gentle counterpoint to the city's waking hum. But today, the velvet-lined case holding my antique violin lay on the kitchen table, heavier than it should have. The instrument had been with me for 30 years, a silent witness to grand concert halls and countless quiet evenings after Chloe was born. Now, it was a gift, a bridge I hoped to build across the growing chasm between my daughter and me. The doorbell chimed, a polite, insistent sound that shattered the stillness. It was Chloe. She stepped inside, her smile bright, almost too bright, and strained around the edges. "Dad, you made it." She pressed a quick kiss to my cheek, her eyes darting to the wrapped case on the table. "What's that?" "Grandfather's violin," I said, my voice steadier than my heart felt. "Thought you might want it for the wedding." Just then, Julian Reed emerged from the living room, a crystal wine glass swirling in his hand. He was tall, sharply chiseled, with perfectly coiffed hair and a bespoke suit that seemed to defy gravity. His gaze swept over me, lingering on my pressed khakis and polo shirt. My best clothes, certainly not enough for his meticulous standards. "Daniel," he said, his handshake brief, dismissive. "Still teaching at the Academy of Arts, are we?" "No, actually, I retired from that a while back," I replied, keeping my tone level. "I'm managing a distribution center now, warehouse logistics." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched Julian's lips. "Ah, steady work is good, but what's in the case, my dearest Chloe?" He shifted his attention to the gift. Chloe eagerly reached for the case, her eyes widening with delight as she unlatched it. The dark, polished maple of the violin gleamed against the red velvet, its strings still taut and true. "Oh, Dad, it's beautiful," Chloe gasped, tracing the delicate curve of its neck. Julian barely glanced at it, his disinterest palpable. A vintage piece, probably worth something to a collector. The casual dismissal stung. This wasn't about money. This was about family, about history, about the echoes of music I'd given up for my daughter's future. Yet, before I could speak, a voice called from the dining room, "Dinner's ready." We moved to the table, another carefully curated display of Julian's wealth and influence. Crystal stemware caught the light from an ornate chandelier, reflecting tiny, distorted galaxies. I took the seat Chloe indicated, feeling increasingly out of place amidst the gleaming silverware and imported china. "So," I began, attempting to bridge the growing silence, "the wedding planning must be exciting. How many guests are you expecting?" Julian cut his steak with surgical precision, his movements economical and devoid of warmth. "We're keeping it intimate. Close friends, professional associates." "My colleagues from the firm," Chloe added, perhaps trying to fill the awkward space. "Julian's business partners, family, of course." "Of course," Julian echoed, but something in his tone made me look up. The conversation flowed around me, a dizzying current of wedding venues, bespoke catering, and exotic floral arrangements. I listened, offering an occasional comment, but Julian's responses grew shorter, his glances more pointed, loaded with an unspoken judgment. Finally, he set down his fork with a decisive click against the porcelain. "Daniel, I think we should discuss something." Chloe's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Julian," she warned, her voice tight. "It's about the wedding," he continued, his voice taking on a boardroom authority, meticulously controlled. "I've been thinking about the guest list, the atmosphere we want to create." My chest tightened, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "What about it?" "Well," Julian leaned back in his chair, completely at ease, as if discussing market trends. "My guests are influential people, tech moguls, venture capitalists, city council members. This isn't just a celebration. It's a networking opportunity. a strategic alignment of our social and professional capital. Julian! Chloe's voice held a sharp, desperate warning now. He ignored her, his gaze locked on mine, cold and unwavering. I need to be direct, Daniel. You're a warehouse manager. My guests move in different circles. Your presence would be problematic. An aesthetic dissonance. The words struck me like a physical blow. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck, my hands clenching into fists beneath the crisp linen napkin. Around the table, a heavy, suffocating silence descended, thick as regret. That's my father! Chloe's voice, usually a gentle melody, snapped like a taut string, echoing off Julian's pristine walls. She rose halfway from her seat, her face pale, a fragile bloom wilting under the harsh glare. Julian, however, merely offered a condescending smile, the kind that promised politeness, but delivered a subtle, chilling cruelty. And I respect that, Chloe, darling, he purred, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. But this wedding, this union, is an investment in our future, a strategic alliance, if you will. I can't risk my reputation, our collective brand, because of misplaced sentimentality. His gaze flickered back to me, holding no warmth, no apology. The hot flush on my face burned, a silent testament to the public humiliation. My hands, hidden beneath the table, clenched into fists, the linen napkin a flimsy shield against the assault. I felt every eye in the room on me, not with pity, but with a detached curiosity, as if I were a particularly uninteresting specimen under a microscope. I found my voice rough, a little hoarse. I raised Chloe. I worked double shifts, sometimes 3, to pay for her education. That was admirable, Daniel, Julian cut me off, his tone a dismissive wave of a hand. But this is reality. You manage a warehouse. My guests create jobs, fund startups, influence policy. Do you truly believe you belong in that conversation? Your presence would introduce a discordant note, an aesthetic dissonance, as I said. The room spun. Chloe was saying something, her voice rising, but the blood pounding in my ears drowned out her words. My sister, Diane, cleared her throat uncomfortably, a small, futile gesture in the suffocating silence. Julian rose from the table, his decision a cold, solid block. Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. Daniel, would you join me on the terrace? The sliding glass door clicked shut behind us, silencing Chloe's choked protests. Julian's terrace, a vast expanse of polished stone and manicured greenery, stretched before me, mirroring the sterile perfection of his life. Below, workers were already meticulously arranging white chairs in the sprawling gardens of the grand ballroom at the Astor, stringing delicate lights between ancient oaks. My daughter's dream laid out before me, a stage from which I was expressly barred. Julian positioned himself against the railing, the Richmond skyline, a glittering testament to his success, framing him like a triumphant portrait. I stood awkwardly near the door, still clutching the violin case, its weight suddenly unbearable. Beautiful view, isn't it? He gestured with a sweeping hand. This venue alone is running us $80,000. The entire event? Close to $250,000. The numbers hit me like a physical blow, each digit a fresh insult. $250,000? My voice was barely a whisper. For one day? Yes. Julian's smile was a thin, joyless line. The bespoke catering is $50,000. The custom floral installations another $20,000. Chloe's gown, a stunning $15,000. Each figure hammered home the chasm between us, a reminder of the $200,000 I'd painstakingly earned, one shipment, one inventory count at a time, to pay for Chloe's education. I paid for Chloe's college, I said, my voice quiet but steady, the words tasting like ash. 4 years at UVA, worked every extra shift, saved every bonus for her apartment after graduation, for her first car. That was then, Daniel. Julian's interruption was sharp, final. This is now. She's my responsibility, and I'm telling you, your presence at this wedding would be an embarrassment. An uncomfortable distraction? The words burned, searing deep. I looked down at the violin case in my hands, grandfather's legacy, which had felt so meaningful an hour ago. You can't just... I can, and I will. Julian moved closer, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. Do you understand what this day means? Senator Maxwell will be there. The governor, CEOs whose companies could shape Chloe's entire future. And you want to what? Serve them hors d'oeuvres? Through the glass door, I could see Chloe pacing in the dining room, her face contorted with worry, her eyes darting towards the terrace. But she made no move to interrupt. "She's my daughter," I said, the desperate plea escaping my lips. "She's my fiancée." Julian's voice was final, absolute, and I won't let you turn her wedding into some pathetic display of misplaced parental pride. This isn't about family sentiment, Daniel. This is about protecting what truly matters, our standing, our image. The workers below had nearly finished arranging the chairs, row after row of pristine white seats, all facing an altar where my daughter would marry this man, where I wouldn't be allowed to sit. Fine. The word came out barely audible, a ragged whisper torn from my throat. "I won't come." Julian's expression didn't change, but I caught a brief, chilling flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "I'm glad we understand each other." He turned, clearly dismissing me. My reflection in the glass looked old, defeated. The familiar lines on my face deepened by a fresh wave of grief. Behind me, Julian remained at the railing, no doubt already planning which influential figure would occupy what should have been my seat. "Daniel," his voice stopped me at the door. "Leave the violin. Chloe shouldn't be burdened with reminders of complications. It's a bit of an antiquated piece anyway. Doesn't quite fit the aesthetic." I paused, my hand on the cold brass handle. The violin case, once a vessel of cherished history, now felt impossibly heavy, filled with the weight of shattered dreams and dismissed sacrifice. Without looking back, I stepped inside, walking past Chloe's questioning, tear-filled gaze, past Diane's concerned frown. I made it to the front door before Chloe caught up to me, her voice choked with sobs. "Dad, wait." "It's fine, sweetheart," I said, my voice barely steady, still clutching the violin case. I pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Congratulations on your engagement." I walked to my car without looking back, the icy grip of Julian's dismissal settling deep into my bones, a winter that threatened to consume me whole. The drive home from Julian's mansion was a blur. The manicured lawns of his exclusive neighborhood faded into the familiar, unassuming streets of Richmond's quieter suburbs, then finally to the aging apartment buildings that clustered together in my part of town. My own building offered no doorman, no polished marble foyer, just the hum of fluorescent lights and mailboxes that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. Each step up the 2 flights of stairs felt heavier than the last, my legs protesting the emotional weight I carried. Inside my 1-bedroom apartment, the silence was absolute, a stark contrast to Julian's echoing hallways. No expensive art adorned my walls, no crystal gleamed under designer fixtures. Just photographs of Chloe, at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, at her high school graduation, brimming with hope, on Christmas mornings when money was tight, but laughter flowed freely. I placed the violin case, grandfather's legacy, on my kitchen table, its dark wood absorbing the dim light. "A vintage piece," Julian had sneered. "Doesn't quite fit the aesthetic." The words twisted in my gut, a bitter reminder of his contempt. My old desk drawer, filled with forgotten bills and expired coupons, yielded a battered calculator. I pulled it out, its plastic keys worn smooth from years of use. Chloe's tuition, year after year, room and board, her first car, a modest down payment scraped from my meager savings, her security deposit when she first moved out. The numbers scrolled across the small screen, a dizzying testament to over $200,000 earned one shipment, one inventory count at a time, 25 years of aching feet, polite smiles, and the quiet dignity of a man who worked hard, often unseen. My phone buzzed, startling me. Chloe's name flashed on the screen, her photo a beacon of innocence in the dim room. "Dad?" Her voice was thick with unshed tears, ragged with the kind of pain that tears at a parent's soul. "I'm so sorry about tonight. Julian had no right." "It's okay, sweetheart," I murmured, my voice a practiced calm. "No, it's not okay." Her voice rose, raw with emotion. "You're my father. You should be at my wedding. He won't change his mind. What are we going to do?" I closed my eyes, listening to her quiet despair. Through my bedroom window, I could see the city lights twinkling in the distance, a sprawling tapestry of human endeavor. Somewhere amidst that glow sat La Trattoria, Roberto's restaurant, where I had spent a significant portion of my life, moving like a phantom in black and white, serving people who rarely learned my name. "Don't worry about it," I told her, the words feeling hollow even to me. "Just focus on being happy. That's all I've ever wanted for you." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness. I rose, walking to my closet, pulling out my work uniform, black pants, a crisp white shirt, the tailored black vest, the costume of invisibility that had paid for Chloe's passage through life. How many high-powered dinners had I overseen? How many influential guests had I ensured were comfortable, utterly oblivious to my presence? Tonight, the uniform felt different in my hands. Not a symbol of servitude, but a disguise, an armor, a possibility. Julian was right about one thing. I was just a warehouse manager, but he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd forgotten that the invisible often see the most. We moved through crucial events, serving the powerful, hearing their unguarded conversations, witnessing their private moments. We are the backdrop, essential but unnoticed. I held up the black vest, studying its simple, clean lines. Tomorrow, I would call Roberto, not as Daniel Price, father of the bride, but as Daniel Price, experienced professional, a silent observer who knew how to disappear into any crowd. Julian Reed was about to learn that some battles couldn't be won with money alone, or with intimidation, or by simply erasing someone from the guest list. He wouldn't suspect that the man refilling his VIP guests' wine glasses might be the very same person he'd tried to humiliate on his gleaming terrace. The violin case caught the dim light from my desk lamp, its polished surface gleaming, a silent promise. Grandfather's legacy, marking moments that truly mattered. Soon, it would mark the moment when a father reclaimed his place at his daughter's wedding. I smiled for the first time all evening, a cold, unwavering resolve hardening in my chest. Saturday morning came too early. Sleep had been impossible, my mind cycling through Julian's words, Chloe's tears, the chilling weight of what I was planning. By 8:30 a.m., I was dressed and driving toward La Trattoria. The familiar route offered no comfort today. The restaurant looked different in the morning light. Empty dining rooms always felt larger, more honest somehow. No guests to perform for, no masks to wear, just tables, chairs, and the quiet hum of preparation. Roberto's SUV sat in the staff parking lot. Good. I needed this conversation to happen before the lunch rush, before other servers arrived with their weekend energy and gossip. Inside, the coffee machine was already brewing, its rich aroma filling the empty space. Roberto stood at the prep station, slicing onions with mechanical precision, his weathered hands moving in a practiced rhythm. 20 years of friendship had taught me to read his moods. Today he seemed troubled, a furrow creasing his brow. "You're early," he said without looking up, his voice gravelly. "Saturday shifts don't start until 10. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, adding sugar to his the way he liked it. The ritual felt important, grounding. "Roberto, I need to ask you something." He accepted the coffee, finally meeting my eyes. Lines around them spoke of long nights and difficult decisions, the weight of keeping a family business alive in an expensive city. "What troubles you, my friend?" The words came harder than I'd expected, each one tasting like betrayal. "Tomorrow is Chloe's wedding, at the Astor." "Ah, yes, the big fancy one," he said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "You must be very proud." "I am," I replied, leaning against the counter, choosing my words carefully. "But there's a problem. Her fiancé, Julian, he doesn't want me there." I watched Roberto's knife stop mid-slice. "He thinks I'm not good enough for his guests. Too embarrassing. Just a warehouse manager," he said. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Roberto slowly set down his knife, his expression shifting from confusion to something hard, something akin to cold steel. "This man, he said this to you? Told you not to come to your own daughter's wedding?" His hands clenched into fists on the worn cutting board. In his voice, I heard the echo of every slight he'd endured as an immigrant in this city, every time someone had looked through him like he didn't matter. What kind of man turns away a father from his daughter's wedding? The kind who cares more about appearances than family. I took a deep breath. "That's why I need your help, Roberto." His eyebrows, thick and dark, rose in surprise. "What can I do?" "Hire me," I said, the words feeling audacious, desperate. "To work the wedding, just for tomorrow, one day." Roberto stared at me as if I'd suggested robbing a bank. "You want to work your own daughter's wedding? Daniel, that's insane. That's undignified." "It's the only way to be there," I insisted, my voice low but firm. "Julian can't forbid a waiter from working his event. I'll be invisible, just part of the service, but I'll see her walk down the aisle. I'll be there when she says her vows." He shook his head slowly, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "This is not right. A father should sit in the front row, not serve drinks to strangers." "Sometimes we don't get what should be," I replied, meeting his gaze. "We take what we can get." Roberto returned to his onions, cutting with more force than necessary, the knife blade catching the morning light, flashing like his changing expressions. "You really want to do this thing?" "I've never wanted anything more." Another long silence settled, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of the knife against the board. Outside, delivery trucks rumbled past, starting their daily routes. Normal Saturday morning sounds for everyone, except me. "The catering company, they handle the service at the Astor," Roberto said finally, his voice gruff, resigned. "But I know their banquet manager, Giuseppe Rossi. We worked together years ago. He owes me favors." My chest tightened with a surge of hope, a warmth spreading through me. "Would he add me to the crew for you?" "Yes, Giuseppe owes me," Roberto confirmed, wiping his hands on his apron. "You're sure about this, Daniel? Once you start serving that man's guests, there's no going back, no dignity in retreat." "My dignity isn't in question here," I said, a cold certainty hardening my tone. "His is." Roberto studied my face, searching for a flicker of doubt he wouldn't find. After 20 years, he knew my stubborn streak as well as anyone. "Okay then," he conceded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "I'll call Giuseppe this morning. You'll work the wedding tomorrow." Relief flooded through me, warm and comforting like the coffee in my hands. "Thank you, Roberto. I won't forget this." "You are a good man, Daniel Price," Roberto said, turning back to his prep work. "If that fancy son-in-law can't see it, that's his blindness, not your fault." As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in hours. Tomorrow, Julian Reed would learn that some battles couldn't be won with money and threats. Some fathers couldn't be bought, intimidated, or erased. The morning sun felt warmer on my face. One more day to wait. The afternoon sun, usually a welcome guest, felt like a harsh spotlight illuminating my clandestine act. 6 hours had melted away since my conversation with Roberto. 6 hours of meticulously arranged lunch service at La Trattoria, smiling at customers, forcing normalcy, all while my mind counted down to tomorrow. The grand ballroom at the Astor loomed before me, a vast empty canvas awaiting tomorrow's masterpiece. Round tables, draped in pristine white linen, dotted the expansive space like islands, each one requiring precise spacing for the seamless dance of servers. I moved between them with practiced ease, adjusting angles, ensuring the flow for tomorrow's performance. Crystal stemware caught the light from the Astor's ornate chandeliers, each setting a small, meticulous sculpture of folded napkins and polished silverware. Chloe's wedding reception would be beautiful, even if I'd only experience it from the shadows of the kitchen. A sudden burst of voices from the lobby made me look up, my hands stilling on the tablecloth I was smoothing. Chloe's laugh, bright but laced with a nervous tension, floated through the ornate doorway, followed by the heavier, self-assured footsteps of a man who owned every room he entered. Julian's voice cut through the afternoon, quiet, sharp, and precise. "The flowers should be positioned there, not blocking the dance floor. We want an uninterrupted line of sight for the media." They were here for the final walkthrough, scrutinizing every detail for tomorrow's grand illusion. I hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for seeing them before the wedding day itself. "Dad?" Chloe's voice, a fragile question, drifted from the doorway. I turned slowly, forcing a smile onto my lips. She looked radiant, even in her casual clothes, her cheeks flushed with a mix of excitement and pre-wedding stress. Behind her, Julian's expression shifted, a swift transition from casual observation to dawning recognition, then to something dark and venomous. "What are you doing here?" His words spat out, sharp, accusatory. "Working," I replied, my voice level, professional, a stark contrast to his rising fury. Roberto asked me to help with setup here. They often handle overflow for large events. Julian's face went rigid, a mask of disbelief. You can't be serious. Chloe stepped between us, her bridal glow dimming, tears already glistening in her eyes. What's wrong now? Her voice cracked, tinged with despair. Your father is manipulating the situation, Julian snarled, his voice escalating, echoing slightly in the grand hall. I told him he wasn't welcome at the wedding, so he gets himself hired as staff? This is a pathetic attempt to humiliate me. I'm here to work, I repeated, straightening another chair, my movements deliberately calm. Nothing more. I have a job to do, Julian. This is not a job! Julian's control shattered, his voice rising to a shout. This is manipulation. You want to humiliate me in front of my guests. You want to remind everyone of your humble origins. The accusation hung in the air like shattered glass, sharp and dangerous. Chloe's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that her perfect wedding day was becoming a public battlefield. Stop it, both of you. Her voice was a broken plea. This is supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Julian pointed at me, his finger rigid with contempt, as if I were contaminating his meticulously crafted event. He's doing this on purpose, Chloe, making himself the victim, forcing his way into spaces where he doesn't belong. He just wants attention. I belong wherever my daughter is, I said quietly, the words cutting through his bluster. Not anymore. Julian's mask of civility finally slipped completely, revealing the raw arrogance beneath. She's my responsibility now, my wife, my guests, my event, and I will not have you serving drinks to people who matter while playing the martyred father. Chloe stepped towards me, tears freely falling now. Dad, you don't have to do this. Please. Yes, I do, I replied, my hand gently touching her trembling shoulder. The silk of her dress felt cold beneath my fingertips. But don't worry, sweetheart. Your guests won't even notice I'm here. I'll just do my job. Your job, Julian spat, his voice laced with venom, is to stay away. This wedding costs more than you make in 5 years. I won't let you turn it into some pathetic statement about your wounded pride. The numbers again. Always the money with him, as if dollar amounts determined human worth. My pride isn't wounded, I said, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering. It's intact, completely. Julian's laugh was a harsh, bitter sound. Is it? Then why this charade? Why not simply accept that some doors are closed to you? Because she's my daughter, I said, the words a quiet declaration. And tomorrow, when she needs her father's blessing, I'll be here to give it, as hired help, as whatever it takes. Chloe was sobbing openly now, quiet tears that broke my heart. Her perfect wedding planning, meticulously crafted, was being destroyed by the very two men who should have been protecting her happiness. Julian whirled, turning towards the exit, his face contorted. We'll see about that. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, a promise of swift, decisive action. Chloe followed him, casting one last, apologetic, heartbroken look over her shoulder. I'm sorry, Dad. Don't be, sweetheart, I murmured, watching her go, her footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. Just focus on being happy tomorrow. They left, the sound of their departure leaving a hollow ache in the vast ballroom. I returned to adjusting tables, but my hands shook slightly now. Julian's parting words carried weight, the promise of more than just empty anger. Through the tall ballroom windows, I watched their car pull away into the gathering dusk. Tomorrow would bring more than I'd bargained for, but tonight, I'd finish preparing the room where my daughter would celebrate the beginning of her new life. Whatever Julian was planning, I'd be ready. The drive back to my quiet apartment felt endless, the city lights blurring into streaks of raw emotion. Julian's cutting words, Chloe's heartbroken sobs. They replayed in my mind, a discordant symphony of pain. I parked the car, the silence of my building's dimly lit garage, a welcome, if temporary, reprieve. Inside my apartment, the air was cold, mirroring the knot in my stomach. I walked to the kitchen, the untouched violin case on the table, a stark reminder of Julian's contempt. Doesn't quite fit the aesthetic. The words echoed, pulling at the frayed edges of my composure. I poured myself a glass of water, the cool liquid doing little to quench the fire in my chest. I paced the small living room, the familiar creak of the floorboards a counterpoint to the turmoil in my mind. Was I doing the right thing? Was this truly about reclaiming my dignity? Or was it a selfish act fueled by wounded pride? Julian's accusation, "You want to humiliate me," clawed at me. The thought of bringing more pain, more embarrassment, to Chloe on her wedding day twisted my gut. She deserved joy. Unadulterated, perfect joy. A framed photograph on the mantel caught my eye. Chloe, no older than 7, her tiny hand gripping my finger as we walk through the autumn leaves at Maymont Park. Her head tilted back, a trusting smile on her face. "Dad," she'd said then, her voice clear and bright. "You're the strongest. You always know what to do." I closed my eyes, a wave of bittersweet memories washing over me. Nights spent tutoring her in math, teaching her to ride her bike in the quiet streets, holding her close during thunderstorms when she was afraid. All those moments, built on a foundation of unconditional love and quiet sacrifice. Had it all led to this? To me, a phantom in black and white, serving champagne at her wedding, an invisible wound in her perfect day? The thought of her walking down the aisle, her face radiant, Julian waiting, and me, watching from the periphery, a ghost in the background. It was a picture that both drew me in and tore me apart. This wasn't just about Julian. It was about Chloe, always about Chloe. How would she react if she knew the depths of his arrogance, or the measures I was taking? Would she understand? Or would she see me as the one truly ruining her day? I sank into my worn armchair, the weight of the decision pressing down. Sleep felt impossible. My mind raced, replaying Julian's sneers, Chloe's tears. I needed to be there. Not just for me, but for her, to witness, to protect, and perhaps to finally bring light to the shadows Julian cast. My hand instinctively reached for the old pocket watch I kept on the side table, its steady tick a quiet reassurance in the overwhelming silence. This battle, I realized, wasn't just for my place. It was for the very soul of what Chloe believed family to be. And for that, I had to see it through, no matter the cost to myself. The sun, a pale, hesitant disk, crept above the Richmond skyline, ushering in the day that felt both inevitable and impossible. I rose from the armchair, a profound weariness in my bones, but also a steel-cold resolve. The black vest and bow tie, laid out neatly on my bed, felt less like a costume of invisibility and more like a uniform of purpose. After a quick shower, the cold water stinging my skin, I dressed meticulously, each button, each knot, a small act of defiance. By 8:30 a.m., I was pulling into the Astor's service entrance, the crisp morning air doing little to shake the nervous hum in my stomach. The grand ballroom, where Julian had delivered his cruel decree yesterday, now felt like a stage, awaiting its silent performer. The hours blurred into a frantic rhythm of preparation. Trays clinked, voices murmured instructions, the scent of expensive flowers mixed with the aroma of gourmet food from the kitchens. Finally, the church bells, distant and muffled, chimed softly, signaling the official end of the ceremony. The first guests spilled into the grand ballroom, a shimmering wave of silk, jewels, and perfectly tailored suits. Crystal chandeliers gleamed, casting a warm, inviting glow over the meticulously arranged tables. White roses cascaded from tall centerpieces, their petals catching the evening light like scattered diamonds. I moved through this elegance, carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes, a ghost in my black vest and bow tie. Chloe entered hand in hand with Julian, her face luminous, a breathtaking vision in white. Her eyes, wide and sparkling with a mixture of joy and nervous energy, scanned the room. For a fleeting second, they met mine across the crowded hall. A silent message passed between us, relief, love, and perhaps a flicker of shared sorrow for the unspoken truth of my presence. A radiant, almost ethereal smile touched her lips before Julian, possessive, drew her attention back to the eager crowd. My heart swelled with a fierce, protective love, mixed with a bitter ache that I stood here, an invisible servant rather than proudly by her side. Julian, ever the showman, led Chloe to the head table, accepting accolades and shaking hands with practiced ease. He seemed to relish every moment, every flash of the photographer's cameras, every influential face in the crowd. As the reception got into full swing, with the orchestra playing light jazz and the clinking of glasses filling the air, Julian rose, tapping his glass with a fork. A hush fell over the room. He stood beside Chloe, his arm around her waist, a picture of the perfect husband. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, amplified by the discreet microphone. "Thank you all for being here on this momentous occasion. Chloe, my beautiful wife." He turned to her, his smile wide, seemingly genuine. "You are the light of my life, and marrying you is the greatest triumph. Together, we will build an empire, a legacy." He then turned back to the guests, his gaze sweeping over the room, a glint in his eye that seemed to search for me, to ensure I was watching. "And to my new family," he continued, a pause, almost imperceptible. Chloe's family, who have, shall we say, instilled in her a certain resilience, a steadfastness that will serve her well in our ambitious future. It wasn't an outright insult, but the subtle emphasis on resilience and the omission of any heartfelt praise for her upbringing, for me, hung in the air like a veiled jab. It was a thinly veiled reminder of my humble background, a subtle way to draw a contrast without saying it directly. Chloe's smile faltered, a flicker of discomfort in her eyes, as she squeezed his arm, perhaps sensing the undertone, perhaps wishing he had chosen different words. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck, but I kept my face impassive, my tray steady. This was his stage, and he was performing for his audience of powerful friends. I was merely a prop, an unseen witness. The insult stung, a tiny, precise cut, but it also hardened my resolve. He wouldn't just humiliate me, he would actively use Chloe to validate his own narrative. As the room filled, the hum of conversation grew, a tapestry woven from whispers and laughter. I moved like a ghost among the tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates. My ears, finely tuned from years of listening for subtle shifts in orchestral dynamics, now picked up snippets of dialogue. Most were trivial, wedding gossip, market predictions, vacation plans. But then, a new thread began to emerge. At a corner table, near a grand floral arrangement, I overheard a man in a pinstriped suit, his face flushed, speaking to a nervous-looking woman. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that now darted nervously around the room. Her name was Eleanor Vance, a prominent figure in local charities, known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue when crossed. She wrung her hands. "He told me it was a sure thing, David. 10% monthly returns. Julian even vouched for them." The man she was speaking to, David Thompson, a well-known local investor, shook his head, his face grim. "But Eleanor, the news. The SEC investigation into those high-yield investment firms. Zenith Capital, Prosperity Solutions. They sound just like what he described. I heard about another one of Julian's assure things yesterday. It went south big time." My hand, holding a half-empty champagne bottle, stilled imperceptibly. Zenith Capital. Prosperity Solutions. The names meant nothing to me, yet the unease in Eleanor and David's voices, the mention of SEC and high-yield returns, snagged my attention like a snagged string. I continued my rounds, ensuring my face remained neutral, my movements fluid. Julian, from the head table, was making a phone call, his back turned slightly, his voice low and urgent. No, I just need a few more days. The transfer is coming, I promise. And make sure Eclat has everything for the post-event feature. Don't make me pull strings." His words were clipped, laced with a desperation that barely skimmed the surface of his confident demeanor. A few minutes later, as I was clearing appetizers near the bar, I saw Julian again. He was in a hushed conversation with a stern-faced man I hadn't seen before, probably a security guard or an aide. Julian's voice was barely a whisper, but I caught fragments. "Keep an eye on him, make sure he doesn't approach anyone important, especially not Senator Maxwell." He gestured subtly in my direction, then nodded towards the older gentleman in the tuxedo I'd served earlier. The evening wore on, a glittering facade over simmering tension. Julian moved among his guests, a practiced smile plastered on his face, but his eyes constantly scanned the room, always returning to my inconspicuous form. At one point during the main course, he approached my station near the kitchen doors, his voice low enough to be heard only by me. "Enjoying the show, Daniel?" he sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. "Make sure the champagne keeps flowing. My guests expect excellence, even from background staff." It was a direct, calculated jab, designed to remind me of my place. I simply met his gaze, my expression unwavering, and replied, "Of course, Mr. Reed. Excellence is our standard." The brief flicker of frustration in his eyes told me my composure was a more potent response than any words. Chloe, ever perceptive, seemed to sense these hidden currents. I saw her glance at me often, her brow furrowed, a silent apology in her eyes. Once, as I passed her table, she momentarily reached out, her fingers brushing my arm. A fleeting, tender touch before Julian's demanding voice from across the table pulled her attention away. It was enough. That brief touch, that shared glance, reinforced why I was here. The dessert course arrived, a symphony of delicate pastries and rich coffees. The music softened, and some guests drifted towards the dance floor. But Julian remained vigilant, his phone still a constant companion, his whispers into it more frequent, more agitated. I overheard fragments of conversations about deadlines missed and funds transfer issues. His facade of effortless charm began to crack around the edges, replaced by an underlying anxiety. Finally, as midnight approached and the last strains of music faded, the reception began to wind down. Guests, satiated and tired, started to trickle out, offering polite goodbyes. I moved with the cleaning crew, collecting discarded napkins and empty glasses, the air now thick with the scent of stale champagne and wilting roses. Julian stood at the exit with Chloe, offering final thank yous. He made no eye contact with me, his gaze sweeping past as if I were truly invisible. Chloe, however, lingered for a moment. As Julian turned to speak with a departing senator, she took a quick step towards me, her voice barely a whisper, thick with exhaustion and emotion. "Dad, thank you for everything I saw." Before I could respond, Julian's hand was on her arm, gently but firmly guiding her away, his smile fixed for the last few guests. She cast one last sorrowful look over her shoulder, then vanished with him into the cool night. The silence of the ballroom after everyone had left was deafening. Tables stripped bare, chairs stacked in neat rows, the lingering scent of celebration quickly turning to emptiness. Roberto approached, a weary but understanding look on his face. "You did good, Daniel. A true professional." He didn't ask about the pain, didn't need to. He knew. "Julian, he's a piece of work, eh? He came back after you left yesterday, offered me 10,000, then 20, to not let you work, threatened my license, my business." My eyes widened. "He did what?" Roberto shrugged, a tired smile touching his lips. "I told him principles aren't for sale, that he showed me who he really is. Don't worry, Daniel, I have friends too. Not rich ones, but loyal ones. He won't touch La Trattoria." Roberto's revelation added another layer to Julian's desperation, confirming his willingness to resort to dirty tactics. "Tomorrow, get some rest, my friend. You earned it." I drove home through the quiet streets, the city lights now a blurred reflection of my own churning thoughts. My apartment, usually a haven of simplicity, felt charged with the day's revelations. I bypassed the armchair, heading straight to my small, cluttered desk. I pulled out a worn notebook and a pen, the one I used for calculations, for meticulous planning. I began to write, connecting the fragmented pieces of conversation, the whispers, the unspoken anxieties. Eleanor Vance, David Thompson, Zenith Capital, Prosperity Solutions, SEC investigation. Julian's hushed phone calls, his agitated demeanor, his obsession with legacy and image for the media. Roberto's story about Julian's threats and desperate attempts to buy him off. It all painted a disturbing picture. Julian wasn't just arrogant. He was likely in deep financial trouble, potentially involved in something illicit, and desperate to maintain a facade of success. The wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a desperate gamble, a calculated performance designed to mask deeper, darker truths. My purpose solidified. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about exposing the truth for Chloe's future. My fingers tightened around the pen, the faint click of the pocket watch on the desk, a steady rhythm in the quiet room. The pieces were starting to fit. The night wore on, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in my apartment as I sat at my desk, my notebook open, its pages filling with fragmented clues. Zenith Capital, Prosperity Solutions, SEC investigation, Julian's desperate calls, and the subtle, almost imperceptible way Chloe's eyes had clouded when Julian spoke of her resilience. It all painted a disturbing picture, a meticulously crafted facade Julian was building, not just for the wedding, but for his entire life. My purpose solidified. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about exposing Julian's carefully constructed world for Chloe's future. My fingers tightened around the pen, the faint click of the pocket watch on the desk, a steady rhythm in the quiet room. The true work of an unseen architect was just beginning. The following morning, after only a few hours of restless sleep, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I found Leo Maxwell's number in my old address book, its pages yellowed with time. Leo, a friend from my classical music days, had traded the concert halls for the glittering, often deceptive world of public relations. He was sharp, perceptive, and knew how to untangle the threads of a carefully woven narrative. My finger hovered over the dial button. It had been years, but some bonds, forged in shared passion and quiet understanding, transcended time. The phone rang twice before his familiar, energetic voice answered. Leo Maxwell here, shaping perceptions, one client at a time. To whom do I owe this early morning serenade? Leo, it's Daniel Price. My voice was a little rough, unused to calling old friends after so long. A brief, surprised pause. Daniel, well, I'll be. Still making music? Last I heard, you were off saving the world, or something equally noble. There was genuine warmth in his tone, mixed with a hint of the old, playful sarcasm. What brings you out of retirement from the classical scene? Life, Leo, always life. I leaned back in my chair, the worn fabric creaking softly. Look, I need your expertise. I'm trying to understand a particular kind of PR, the kind that turns social events into brand launches. Ah, the prestige event specialists, Leo chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. My bread and butter, in a way. What's the specific company? Eclat Events and Media, I said, watching the words hang in the air. Have you heard of them? Eclat? Leo's tone shifted, a hint of professional interest sharpening his voice. Oh yes, they're at the top of that particular heap. Not just event planners, mind you. They're narrative architects. They don't just organize the party. They curate the image. Their whole game is about crafting a story for the media, securing features in society magazines, getting buzz on exclusive blogs. They create the illusion of effortless perfection for clients who are anything but effortless. His words were a mirror reflecting Julian's entire persona. Their clientele list reads like a who's who of Richmond's aspiring elite, or those trying to solidify their positions. They specialize in turning a private celebration into a public statement, a power couple debut, that sort of thing. Why do you ask? Julian Reed, I stated, the name feeling heavy on my tongue. He hired them for his wedding with Chloe. Reed, Leo exclaimed, a new note of understanding in his voice. Makes perfect sense. I heard he was making a big push into the old money circles. A high-profile wedding is his equivalent of a public offering. Eclat would ensure every photo angle, every guest interaction, every moment is perfectly staged for maximum impact. They'd probably be looking for a feature in Richmond Society or Virginia Life, the kind of spread that announces you've arrived. Leo's confirmation was chilling. It wasn't just my imagination. Julian wasn't simply planning a wedding. He was orchestrating a meticulously controlled narrative, turning Chloe's sacred day into a mere backdrop for his ambition. After we hung up, the words narrative architects resonated in my mind. Julian wasn't living his life. He was branding it. I returned to my laptop, typing Eclat Events and Media into the search bar, then Richmond Society Weddings, Virginia Life Power Couples. Eclat's website was glossy, filled with images of radiant couples, extravagant decor, and prominent socialites. Their tagline, "We don't just plan events. We craft legacies," now sounded less like a promise and more like a warning. I found articles detailing their past projects, each one a testament to their ability to transform a personal event into a public spectacle. The pieces of Julian's intricate game were beginning to align. A few days after the wedding, I found an excuse to visit Chloe at her new townhouse. Ostensibly, I was dropping off some old photo albums she'd wanted from her childhood, a tangible reminder of simpler times. She greeted me with a warm, tired smile, the bridal glow already softened by the quiet realities of married life. We settled into her elegant living room, the space still feeling new and a little too perfect, sipping tea while she flipped through the albums, reminiscing. Suddenly, a loud, frustrated shout ripped through the quiet of the house, startling us both. The voice was unmistakably Julian's, coming from his study upstairs, usually a sanctuary of hushed calls and closed-door meetings. "No, absolutely not. I told you, Victor, I need those funds by Friday. This isn't negotiable. If Ascendant Ventures doesn't deliver, everything collapses." His voice, usually so controlled, was raw with desperation, laced with a barely contained fury. He slammed his hand against something heavy, the thud echoing through the floorboards. "The next round of investors is counting on this. And don't tell me about the SEC again. We have this covered. Just get the funds cleared." Another crash, then silence, thick and tense. Chloe flinched, her hand flying to her chest. Her eyes met mine, wide with unspoken fear and confusion. A fragile mask of composure momentarily shattered. He's been like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "On edge, always on the phone. It's not like the Julian I know." She didn't offer details, but her distress, the subtle tremor in her hands, told me more than words ever could. "Sounds like a lot of pressure, sweetheart," I murmured, a chill creeping down my spine. Victor, Ascendant Ventures, the names, the desperation, the frantic demands for funds, and the mention of the SEC, they clicked into place with the fragments Eleanor and David had discussed at the wedding. This wasn't just stress from a new marriage. This was a man teetering on the edge of something far more perilous. Each observation, each strained glance from Chloe, added another crucial piece to the puzzle. Julian's carefully constructed world was not merely a facade of success. It was a desperate gamble, a house of cards built on unstable ground, and the foundation was beginning to tremble. A few evenings later, as dusk settled over Richmond, I made my way to La Trattoria. The familiar glow of the restaurant sign felt like a beacon in the quiet street. Inside, Roberto was meticulously polishing wine glasses behind the bar, the familiar scent of garlic and simmering tomatoes hanging in the air. "Busy, Daniel?" he asked, a knowing glint in his eye as he looked up. "Always," I replied, taking a seat at the bar. "But I needed a break, and I need to ask you something else about Julian." Roberto set down a glass, his expression darkening. "That man, he thinks money buys everything." He then recounted Julian's second attempt at a bribe, larger and more aggressive than the first. "He came back, Daniel, after you left the Astor, offered me 10,000, then 20, to not let you work the wedding, threatened my liquor license, my health inspections, said he had friends in high places." Roberto scoffed, a deep rumble in his chest. "I told him principles aren't for sale, that he showed me who he really is. Don't worry, Daniel, I have friends too, not rich ones, but loyal ones. He won't touch La Trattoria." My grip tightened on the counter. "I heard a name, Roberto, when Julian was on the phone at Chloe's, Ascendant Ventures. Does that ring any bells? He sounded desperate." Roberto paused, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. He rubbed his chin, a gesture he made when deep in thought. "Ascendant Ventures, you say? That name, it rings a faint bell. Not a good one." He walked to the old, battered landline phone on the wall behind the bar, picked up the receiver, and dialed. "Excuse me for a moment, Daniel. This might be important." I watched him as he spoke in rapid Italian, his voice low and concerned. After a few minutes, he hung up, his face grim. "Ascendant Ventures?" "Yes. My friend, Marco Rossi, he owns the Golden Spoon over in Old Town. Good man. He was just telling me about this. Julian Reed, he approached Marco a few months ago, raving about some exclusive investment opportunity with this Ascendant Ventures. Promised incredible returns, a guaranteed 10% monthly yield. Said it was only for select partners in Richmond's elite business circles, vouched for it personally." Roberto leaned against the bar, his voice heavy with disappointment and anger. "Marco, he's a hardworking man, Daniel. Saved every penny. He invested $50,000. Julian promised him it would triple in a year, money for his daughter's college. Now Marco can't get any of his money back. Ascendant Ventures keeps giving him excuses, delaying tactics, says it's temporary market fluctuations. But Marco, he's scared. He thinks it's a scam. He thinks Julian, he played him. The pieces clicked into place, stark and undeniable. Julian wasn't just desperate, he was actively preying on people, using his carefully crafted facade to lure them into a financial trap. Marco Rossi was the concrete proof, the direct victim, a testament to Julian's transformation from arrogance to active deceit. His testimony, raw and heartbreaking, was the fuel I needed. Armed with this damning confirmation, I knew Julian's perfect facade was about to shatter. The next steps would be the hardest, and they would demand a level of confrontation I had spent years avoiding. My fingers tightened around the pen, the faint click of the pocket watch on the desk, a steady rhythm in the quiet room. The true work of an unseen architect was just beginning. I knew I needed a deeper dive, something more than just victim testimonies and overheard conversations. I turned to Leo Maxwell. Our previous call had confirmed his sharp mind and vast network. This time, my questions were more pointed, the stakes far higher. "Leo," I began, my voice low and serious when he answered. "I need your insight on something beyond PR. Have you ever heard anything about an investment firm called Ascendant Ventures? Or a character named Victor Sterling in the Richmond financial scene?" There was a noticeable pause on the other end, longer than before. "Ascendant Ventures," Leo repeated slowly, a hint of caution in his tone. "That name has come up in certain circles, not good circles. More like whispers in the wind, a bad omen." He paused again, then continued, his voice dropping. "Victor Sterling. Yes, he's a legend in a very dark way. Master of the exclusive opportunity scam. Promises the moon, delivers a crater. There have been rumors, quiet investigations by the SEC, but he's slippery. Uses intermediaries, influencers who recruit for him." My blood ran cold. "Influencers?" "Exactly," Leo affirmed. "Someone with social standing, a network. They vouch for the scheme, often unknowingly at first, then get pulled deeper, becoming recruiters themselves to recoup their own losses or earn massive commissions. It's a classic Ponzi model, Daniel. They drain the new money to pay the old investors, or, in Sterling's case, to fund his lavish lifestyle and keep his recruiters quiet." Leo's words confirmed my worst fears, painting a grim picture of Julian's descent. He wasn't just caught in a bad deal, he was actively facilitating a criminal enterprise. It was sickening. Leo also provided me with crucial details about how such schemes operate, how they often target ambitious, image-conscious individuals, and how the collapse usually comes swift and brutal, leaving a trail of ruined lives. He even pointed me towards public records of past SEC warnings regarding similar high-yield investment scams, providing further corroboration. The week that followed was a strategic chess game, played out in the quiet corners of Richmond's social circles. My target, Eleanor Vance and David Thompson, the couple I'd overheard at the wedding, who now represented a powerful, if unwitting, leverage against Julian. I couldn't approach them directly as a warehouse manager. It would be too suspicious, too out of place. I needed an introduction, a subtle opening. I called Leo Maxwell again. "Leo, I need a favor. You know Eleanor Vance and David Thompson, don't you? From the charity circuit." "Eleanor? David?" Leo paused. "Of course. They're influential. What about them?" "I have reason to believe they, like others, might have been drawn into something problematic," I stated, choosing my words carefully. "An investment, perhaps, with Ascendant Ventures." There was a sharp intake of breath from Leo. "Ascendant? Daniel, what are you getting at?" "I have proof," I replied simply. "Proof that Julian Reed has been actively recruiting people into this scheme, vouching for it personally. And I have a victim, a friend of Roberto's, who lost his life savings because of Julian's endorsement, Marco Rossi." Leo was silent for a long moment, the implications settling between us. "This is big, Daniel. Julian Reed is connected. This could unravel a lot of things." "Precisely," I said. "Eleanor Vance, especially. She's deeply involved in the charity world. If she's lost money, especially if it's tied to charitable funds or public trust, she'd be desperate to cover it up, to recover. I believe she may have overextended herself, maybe even taken drastic measures." "You mean?" Leo's voice was barely a whisper. "I mean, I think her situation, and David's, makes them vulnerable. They need a way out, quietly. I can offer them a path to truth, and perhaps to justice. but they need to trust me, and they need to understand that Julian is the cause of their troubles, not the solution. Leo agreed to arrange a discreet meeting, framing it as a confidential discussion regarding a mutual concern in the Richmond investment community. He knew how to navigate these waters. A few days later, I sat across from Eleanor and David in a private room at a quiet downtown cafe, far from the prying eyes of Julian's social circle. Leo had set the stage perfectly. Eleanor looked pale, her usual composure replaced by a desperate tension. David, grim-faced, sat beside her. I laid out the evidence: Marco Rossi's signed account, copies of Julian's promotional emails for Ascendant Ventures, and Leo's expert assessment of the scheme. I spoke calmly, professionally, without accusation, detailing how Ascendant Ventures was designed to collapse, and how Julian, despite his public persona, was a key recruiter. Eleanor's hands, usually so steady presiding over charity galas, trembled visibly. He guaranteed it, she whispered, her voice cracking. Julian said it was solid. I even moved a significant portion of my private endowment from the Vance Family Trust for the Children's Hospital wing. Her voice trailed off, horror dawning in her eyes. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. She had used funds entrusted for charity, a grave breach of public trust, a desperate gamble to make up for losses elsewhere. David Thompson, though shaken, listened intently. I saw the signs, Eleanor, but Julian was so convincing. He promised us access to Victor Sterling directly, talked about exclusive IPOs. I lost a substantial sum too, though not from a foundation. I offered them a lifeline. I'm not here to judge. I'm here because Julian Reed needs to be held accountable, and because I believe the victims deserve justice. If you cooperate, if you provide your testimony and evidence, we can build a case. A quiet one, at first, away from the public eye, but strong enough to bring this scheme down, and to address the source of your current difficulties. My gaze met Eleanor's, a silent understanding passing between us. She knew exactly what I meant about her current difficulties. Eleanor looked at David, then back at me, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes. What exactly would that entail? She asked, her voice thin. The first domino was set to fall, pushed by the weight of its own deception. The days following my meeting with Eleanor and David were tense, a quiet storm gathering on Julian's horizon. I could almost feel the subtle shifts in the social currents, the whispers beginning to circulate in the exclusive circles Julian so desperately sought to impress. Eleanor, a woman of considerable influence in Richmond's charity scene, wouldn't make a scene, but her quiet withdrawal and David's pointed silences at various social engagements would be noticed. Julian's carefully cultivated image, meticulously crafted by Eclat events and media, was starting to fray. Meanwhile, the stark reality of the wedding's extravagant cost began to hit Julian with brutal force. The Astor's final bills, the bespoke catering, the imported flowers, they all piled up, far exceeding the projected expenses, especially with the Ascendant Ventures funds now frozen or gone. His initial confidence, inflated by the wedding's grandeur, was rapidly deflating. Julian's sleek townhouse, once a symbol of his effortless success, now felt like a gilded cage, filled with mounting anxieties. I still visited Chloe, bringing over homemade dishes that offered a comforting taste of simpler times. Each visit was a window into Julian's increasingly desperate state. His composure, usually as polished as his Italian leather shoes, had cracked. He barked orders into his phone, his voice often thin and reedy, filled with a frantic edge. He'd slam the phone down, then run a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, his face a mask of frustration. Chloe would flinch at his outbursts, her eyes, usually so bright, now shadowed with worry. She rarely spoke directly of Julian's financial troubles, but her unspoken fear filled the silence between us. The calls Julian was making weren't just to vendors or distant associates. One late afternoon, as I sat with Chloe in the living room, a furious shout erupted from Julian's study upstairs. "What do you mean, default? We had a deal, Mark. You promised flexibility. If I don't settle the remaining balance by Friday, you're calling the lawyers? This is unacceptable." The mention of Mark Mason, the very man who orchestrated Julian's perfect wedding, confirmed my suspicions. Julian wasn't just short on funds. He was in deep, borrowing from high-interest lenders to cover his tracks. The pieces of his financial desperation were fitting together too perfectly. Chloe rose, her face pale, the teacup trembling slightly in her hand. "Mark Mason?" she whispered, bewildered. "He's our wedding planner, Dad. Why would Julian owe him money after the wedding? What does default mean?" She looked at me, a raw, innocent question in her eyes that cut straight to my heart. I simply offered her a reassuring look, my heart aching for her confusion. I couldn't tell her everything yet, not until I had all the pieces securely in place, ready to present the full, undeniable truth. The pressure mounted daily. Julian's carefully curated image was crumbling from within. Whispers began to circulate in the club rooms and charity galas that Julian attended, fueled by subtle shifts from Eleanor and David. People started to notice Julian's increasingly desperate demeanor, his forced smiles, the way he'd abruptly end conversations about investments. His usual friends from the financial elite began to subtly distance themselves, sensing weakness or, worse, toxicity. Julian Reed, the rising star, was being doused by the cold water of reality, cornered by his own ambition and deceit. He was being squeezed, and soon he would break. The mounting pressure was taking its toll on Julian. His once impenetrable facade was cracking, revealing the desperate man beneath. He lashed out more often, his voice echoing through the townhouse, chilling Chloe into silence. The whispers from the social circles intensified, fueled by Eleanor Vance and David Thompson's quiet discontent. Julian Reed, the meticulously crafted brand, was on the verge of collapse. It was time for me to make my final move. Days turned into a blur of meticulous preparation. I dedicated every free moment, late into the night, to assembling my evidence. The stack of papers on my desk grew. Marco Rossi's signed testimony, detailing Julian's recruitment tactics for Ascendant Ventures, and the devastating loss of his life savings. Copies of the glossy brochures and emails Julian had personally distributed, with his name prominently displayed as an advisor. Leo Maxwell's chilling confirmation of Ascendant Ventures as a classic Ponzi scheme, run by the elusive Victor Sterling, and the public SEC warnings about similar high-yield scams. I even cross-referenced Julian's known social engagements with Ascendant's recruitment events, seeing a pattern of manipulation. I compiled everything into a concise, undeniable report. This wasn't a dossier meant for the police, not yet anyway, but a stark, undeniable truth aimed directly at Julian's carefully constructed reality. My goal wasn't just to expose the fraud, but to force Julian to confront himself and ultimately to confess. I knew I needed to hit Julian where it hurt most: his image, his control, and his relationship with Chloe. Publicly exposing Julian now would be messy, dragging Chloe through a scandal she didn't deserve. I wanted Julian to break on his own terms, to confront his lies. The most effective way to do this was through Chloe, not to hurt her, but to empower her with the truth, allowing her to see who Julian truly was, forcing Julian to choose between maintaining his monstrous lie and the remnants of his marriage. One quiet afternoon, I called Chloe, asking her to meet me for coffee at a small, unassuming cafe, far from Julian's usual haunts. My voice was calm, but carried a gravity that made Chloe agree without question. When she arrived, her eyes were shadowed, her usual sparkle dimmed by worry. "Dad," she began, her voice weary. "What's wrong? Is it about Julian?" I looked at my daughter, my heart aching. This was the hardest part. I pushed a slim manila folder across the table towards her. It contained only a few select documents: Marco Rossi's original signed affidavit detailing Julian's recruitment, a single damning email from Julian promoting Ascendant Ventures, and a public SEC warning about Ponzi schemes, with the definition highlighted. "Chloe," I said, my voice soft but firm, "I need you to look at this. Alone. Please, read it carefully. Understand what you're seeing." Chloe's brow furrowed in confusion as she picked up the folder. "What is this, Dad? Ascendant Ventures? Julian said he was just exploring new investment opportunities." "Read it," I urged, my gaze unwavering. "And then I want you to confront Julian. Not with anger, but with the truth. Because this isn't just about money, sweetheart. It's about who Julian truly is, and the danger he puts himself, and everyone around him, in." I saw the fear, then a dawning horror in her eyes as she flipped through the first few pages. The sheer weight of the evidence, presented concisely and without emotion, was designed to be undeniable. It was a truth bomb, carefully aimed, intended to shatter Julian's world from the inside out, forcing him into a corner from which the only escape was a full confession. I had handed Chloe the key, and now it was up to her to unlock the door. I left Chloe in the quiet cafe, giving her space to process the unbearable weight of what she'd just read. The hours that followed were agonizing. I imagined her, alone, piecing together the betrayal, the intricate web of lies Julian had woven around her, around everyone. The silence stretched, thick with dread. Then, late that evening, my phone rang. It was Chloe, her voice a raw, broken whisper. "Dad," she choked out, I showed Julian. He tried to deny it. He yelled, he screamed. But I saw the fear in his eyes. Dad, it was raw. And then her voice dissolved into sobs. "He said he needed to see you. Now he's coming over." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The confrontation I had both dreaded and meticulously orchestrated. I hung up, took a deep breath, and stood by my living room window, watching the streetlights illuminate the quiet Richmond night. A sleek black sedan, unmistakably Julian's, pulled up to my curb. The doorbell chimed, a timid sound compared to the storm brewing inside. I opened the door. Julian stood there, not in his usual tailored suits, but in a rumpled shirt, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, a man whose carefully constructed world was finally crashing down. Behind him, Chloe appeared, her face pale and streaked with tears, her arm clutched around herself as if in pain. "Daniel!" Julian rasped, his voice hoarse, devoid of its usual arrogance. "We need to talk." He stumbled into my living room, past me, and collapsed onto my worn armchair, the very chair where I had wrestled with my own demons just nights before. Chloe remained by the door, watching him with a haunted, distant look. "What is it, Julian?" I asked, my voice calm, unwavering. He ran a trembling hand through his hair. "Chloe," she showed me, "your little folder." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're good, Daniel. Better than I thought." He looked at me, a flicker of something close to desperation in his eyes. "Okay, it's true, all of it. Ascendant Ventures, it's a scam, a Ponzi scheme, and I'm involved." Chloe gasped, a raw, wounded sound, finally stepping into the room, her eyes fixed on Julian. Julian closed his eyes, then opened them, revealing a depth of pain and fear I hadn't expected. I was stupid, arrogant. His voice was barely a whisper now, the facade completely gone. Victor Sterling. He approached me months ago, promised me millions, a shortcut to the kind of wealth Julian Reed deserved. I invested, 200,000 of my own money, and I lost it, all of it. He called it a temporary setback, then offered me a way out, to be an influencer, to bring in new investors, like a recruiter. He said I'd get my money back, plus a cut of every new dollar. I was desperate, Daniel, desperate to keep up appearances, desperate to replace what I'd lost. The wedding? It was supposed to be my big debut, my public offering, to attract more marks. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. It just spiraled, and now Mark Mason is demanding his money. Eleanor and David, they know. The SEC, they're closing in. It's all collapsing. Chloe rushed forward, her face a mix of horror and profound sadness. "Julian, you actually did this? To people? To Marco?" He looked up, tears streaking his face. "I'm so sorry, Chloe. I was trapped. I thought I could manage it. Just a few more investors, just enough to get my money back. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." His words were hollow, the excuses of a man who had lost his way. I watched him, my heart a complex mix of sorrow and grim satisfaction. This was the moment. This was the raw truth I had sought. "You got trapped by your own ambition, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through his despair. "You valued an image more than honesty, more than the people around you." Chloe stood over him, her body rigid. "You lied to me, to everyone. You used our wedding as a cover." The raw pain in her voice was palpable. "I don't even know who you are anymore." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by Julian's ragged breathing. His confession hung in the air, a shattered mirror reflecting his true self. This was the culmination of everything. His pride, his ambition, his deceit, all laid bare. The foundation of his perfect life and his marriage had crumbled. Chloe looked at Julian, then at me, her eyes begging for an answer that no one could give. The road ahead for her, for Julian, for their marriage, was uncertain, fraught with unimaginable challenges. But at least now she saw the truth. I gave them space. Chloe stayed that night, curled on my old sofa, her tears eventually giving way to a hollow, distant stare. Julian left, his departure as abrupt and desperate as his confession. He didn't look back. The days that followed were a blur of cold, hard realities. The SEC's investigation into Ascendant Ventures, already in motion, gained momentum with the new testimonies from Marco Rossi, Eleanor Vance, and David Thompson, all of whom, with my subtle guidance, courageously stepped forward. Their stories, backed by the evidence I had compiled, were damning. News of Ascendant Ventures' collapse ripped through Richmond's financial circles. Victor Sterling, the mastermind, vanished, but his network, including Julian, quickly came under intense scrutiny. Julian's name, once whispered with admiration, was now irrevocably tainted by scandal. His friends from the financial elite vanished faster than champagne bubbles. Lawsuits mounted, their legal papers piling up like bitter snow. His assets were frozen, every meticulously acquired luxury slated for liquidation to compensate the victims. Julian Reed, the man who craved a legacy, was left with nothing but ruin and the harsh glare of unwanted public exposure. Chloe was devastated. She moved back into my apartment, seeking refuge in the familiar comfort of her childhood home. Her perfect life, built on Julian's glittering promises, had shattered. The first few weeks were filled with tears, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. She watched the news reports about Ascendant Ventures, each headline a fresh wound. But slowly, painfully, a new kind of strength began to emerge in her. She filed for divorce, a quiet, heartbreaking act of self-preservation. It wasn't easy, but she faced it with a quiet determination I hadn't known she possessed. She understood now. A life built on lies could never truly be her own. For me, the victory felt bittersweet. Julian's downfall was complete, his humiliation public. But seeing Chloe's pain, the collateral damage of his deceit, was a constant ache. Yet, in that pain, a profound healing began. Chloe would sit with me in the evenings, not just talking, but truly listening. She'd ask about my old life, about the concert halls, about the decisions I'd made. One afternoon, she found the antique violin case, still sitting on the kitchen table. "Dad," she said, her voice soft, tracing the polished wood. "You gave up so much for me, didn't you?" "All of it. The music. Your passion." "I gained more than I lost, sweetheart," I replied, meeting her gaze. "A daughter who grew into an extraordinary woman, and the peace of knowing I chose what truly mattered." My eyes rested on her, brimming with love and a newfound understanding. "You're a stronger woman than I ever knew, Chloe. You saw the truth, and you chose it. That's true courage." She leaned into me, tears finally flowing, not from pain, but from a deep, cleansing release. Our bond, once strained by unspoken truths, was now stronger than any legal document, any social facade. Life in my quiet Richmond apartment resumed its rhythm, but it was a rhythm subtly altered. Marco Rossi, Eleanor Vance, and David Thompson all contacted me, offering their heartfelt thanks. They might not fully recover their lost fortunes, but they had found closure and a renewed sense of justice. My role as the unseen architect, the quiet observer, had ended. I continued my work at the distribution center, finding quiet satisfaction in its order and predictability. But sometimes, in the evenings, Chloe would ask me to play. I'd take out grandfather's violin, the wood warm against my cheek, and let the music fill the small apartment. No grand concert halls, no cheering crowds, just the pure, honest notes and the appreciative silence of my daughter. Julian Reed served his time, stripped of his wealth and his manufactured image. He learned the true meaning of legacy, not what one accumulates, but what one leaves behind. His story became a cautionary tale in Richmond, a stark reminder that true success cannot be built on lies or at the expense of others. And me? I found a deeper peace than I'd ever known. My name might never flash on a marquee or be whispered in elite circles, but I had my daughter, whole and true. I had my dignity restored and fortified. And I had the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the symphony of life demanded a discordant note, I had played the right one. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.